When I first watched the documentary Join or Die on Netflix, it was months ago at this point, it was such a surreal experience seeing the work and craft that I do day in and day out featured in mainstream media. And to see the data and the full narrative behind the thing that we intuitively have recognized a gap and a need for, and that is community and connection and the building of social capital. When my friend, shout out to Seth Ressler for his kindness and generosity, offered to introduce me to the director and producer of Join or Die, I about died. I was so honored to get to sit down with Rebecca and go a little bit deeper into some of the themes of the documentary and also draw the bridge into the online community building space that I live in. Make sure you stick around all the way to the end because Rebecca shares the single most powerful thing any of us can do to not only make our nation less polarized politically, but to ultimately build the trust and connections and social capital that are in sharp decline. Enjoy.
Welcome to Dear Bree, an advice column for community conundrums, fiascos, and drama. This season of Dear Bree is sponsored by our friends over at Heartbeat. Heartbeat is an all-in-one community platform, and it's the one I chose to host my own community. Your members can finally have events, conversation, content, and even courses in one distraction-free, intimate, customized home. I chose Heartbeat for 3 reasons. First, Heartbeat is unparalleled in their events management features. Events are a core part of my community architecture, and their features make my life so much easier. Second is segmentation. It's super easy to break my community into smaller, more niche subgroups and create a more customized experience for that group in Heartbeat. And finally, their courses. Being able to host my educational materials and learning journey in a community-first platform makes my community that much more valuable and retention that much stickier. I'm an affiliate with Heartbeat, which means when you sign up through my link in the show notes, I get paid a small amount at no extra charge to you. Thank you for supporting my work in that way. And finally, I usually record this podcast from Hawaii Island, so a special thank you to the Kanaka Maoli people on whose land I currently reside.
Our guest today, Rebecca Davis, is a director and producer of short and long-form documentaries. She was a senior producer with NBC News for nearly a decade, where she focused on social movements, environmental and economic justice, and community innovators. She has produced for HBO, Vice, and A&E, and was the supervising producer for season 2 of Vox's Netflix show, Explained. Most relevant to this podcast episode is her first feature-length documentary, Join or Die, which I would describe as an observation and commentary on the decline of social capital in the U.S. over the last 2 decades and its implications for democracy. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to be on with you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, and I have to just observe and follow it up with a question. The title Join or Die comes from a statistic that is used in the film that says the odds of you dying in the next year are cut in half when you join a club, which is quite jarring. At first I thought, Join or Die, is this like a documentary about cults? Which got me because I love cults. And then it was even better. It was exactly
cults are really just extreme joining. So, yes, those come up a lot.
Yes. That keep you alive until they don't.
For the record, we are not encouraging anyone to join a cult.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the film follows the journey of Robert Putnam, whose study of democracy in Italy led to his writing the book Bowling Alone about the declining state of social capital in the U.S., for those of you who haven't seen this documentary yet. And I have to ask before we get started, Rebecca, there was a lot of terms used for what we are talking about. There's social capital, civic life, civic engagement, joining clubs, memberships, associations. And this is all describing what I use predominantly as the word community. But I've noticed that term was almost conspicuously absent from the film. And
I'm curious, was that on purpose or am I just like reading into something here?
Yeah, it was not on purpose, but I will say maybe what you're getting at is we hear the word community now all the time, almost to a point where I worry it's losing its meaning. And because what one person will say is a community, I'm in a community because I'm a member of this Facebook group that pings me with random notifications every once in a while. And another person will describe the community as maybe a religious organization that they've participated in for 40 years and meet up weekly. And both of those people are using the same word, but they're describing different things. And so I think in the film, what we were trying to get at, we're looking more at this idea of social capital. And that is the stuff that can be built out of community bonds of trust and reciprocity. I think a shorthand way of saying that is community. But I think it's important that we get into these nuances because there is a difference between those kind of two descriptions. Meeting up with people decades after decades, people that are coming to care for you when you're sick, people that are with you on the worst and best day of your life, versus maybe a professional association that I might be a part of online and on LinkedIn and helps me out a little bit when I need to pass a resume around, but doesn't really know me in that kind of deep way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other. I think we need both of those things. And what we are over-indexed on right now is, I think, the shallow type of community. And so this film project was an effort to get us talking and thinking about the meaning behind that word and that deeper type of connection that comes from organizations and associational life.
That's really good. Yeah, as someone who has waged the SEO war on getting as much exposure to the term community as possible, I really appreciate the specificity of getting more specific about what type of group and what type of community we're actually talking about. So it was something I noticed, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that you all made that distinction in the film. The other thing that what you just said brought up, and the term social capital is something I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. And Robert puts it really beautifully and simply in the film and says social capital is basically the value of your social connections. And what I think is so helpful about that term, it puts language to something that feels very slippery in community building. And I often highlight, because people will talk about how connections with other members is valuable in a community. And part of what I've grown into and learned from other community builders, even in the space, is that connection in itself isn't necessarily an outcome. It's a vehicle for this outcome, which is social capital. It is the building of the value of these social connections. And so I didn't even put that all together because I'll often guide my clients in saying, if you're going to use connection in your marketing language or to talk about what happens in your community, you have to get really specific about what's the actual outcome that the connections are leading to. And I'm excited to see social capital become more in our vernacular to use it as the outcome.
Yeah. And I think that's the same thing between the word community and looking at kind of surface level, how is that used and thrown around? Going one step further, as you mentioned, to look at the outcomes to see if it's really living up to its full potential. I think I'm connected to 3,000 people last I checked on Facebook. But are those 3,000 people someone that I could email if I lost a job? No. So we need to go a step beyond just quote unquote connected as we are on the internet to really ask, as you mentioned, what is the quality of those connections? What is the depth of that relationship?
Yeah, that's really good. Are you ready for the letter I have prepared for you today?
Yes, excited to hear it.
All right. Dear Bree, I'm a community builder and I like to consider myself someone who creates bridges even across the political divide. But what I'm writing about today is more personal. My question is, how can we actually bridge the political gap in our communities when it all feels so impossibly polarized? Here's my personal conundrum that's a pending fiasco at any given moment. I come from a tight-knit family who I love deeply, but they are hardcore MAGA supporters. Thanksgiving dinners have basically turned into silent performances where everyone tiptoes around anything meaningful, terrified to spark the next shouting match. I tried to break the ice last month by asking my dad what he was most proud of in his life, hoping we could find some common ground in family or values. But he ended up ranting about how the country's gone to hell and how proud he is to stand up to the woke mob. How do we have these hard conversations with family or in our online communities without everything blowing up? Is it even possible? Or are we destined to keep living in parallel worlds? If I can't even have these conversations with my family, the people who love and support me the most, how can we hope to have them in some of the digital spaces we're involved in? What's the role of community in this political chaos? Should we be figuring out how to have more political conversations in our communities? And if so, how? A part of me feels compelled to, and the other part just wonders if any good comes from it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on community's role, if any, in bridging the political divide. Signed, Walking on Eggshells. I don't know about you, but I easily could have written this letter, and I think if you're existing in any social circle with any difference of political opinion in the US today, you probably deeply resonate with this letter. So, Rebecca, maybe to kick things off, what stands out to you in this letter?
First of all, I think just echoing what you said, Brie, I think that is an experience that most of us in America have either had personally in our own families, as this writer is expressing, or knows a friend that has been going through this. And that's no surprise. The data backs that up. We are living through one of the most polarized moments politically in our nation's history since our founding. And I think what jumps out for me in hearing that writer asking, how do we move forward in these conversations? And I think the answer, and as I look to what I learned from spending all this time with Bob's work, the answer might not be in conversation, which I think is counterintuitive, because a lot of the efforts in recent years have been, how do we get someone who thinks this way and another person who thinks this way, put them in a room, get them talking about the divides and try to figure it out. What Robert Putnam's work, both in his book Bowling Alone, that came out in 2000, that got its title famously from the decline in bowling leagues, but he branched out from there to all types of ways people were getting together, and that we highlight in the film, is that people in communities, for much of our history in America until more recently, were building connection and building social capital through shared projects. So it wasn't that they were having conversation in between people stepping up to the lane to bowl. Maybe they were chatting about what was happening at the school board meeting or how things were going with each other's family. But they were ultimately building something together. And I think that is where we need to hone in on as we look to kind of heal this moment. And I think we've seen this. We're trying to have these conversations and they're turning into shouting matches. I think we need to work on building shared projects together and have that be the first step and have the conversations follow. So for this writer coming in, it might be a matter of getting everyone out of the dinner table and heading out to go clean up a local park together or build a gazebo in the town square, getting together to really get our hands dirty and build something and let the conversations come after that. Because I just think the conversations right now aren't productive. And I think building shared projects together, we can get a running start towards getting back to a better place. And then the only other thing that jumped out for me is I noticed the writer said, how do we begin to have these conversations in our digital spaces? I also am not convinced that's the place the conversations are going to be the most productive. A lot of them, these quote unquote, again, conversations end up being a little bit more of shouting into the void that I see happening online. There's a lot of kind of talking at each other. And I think for those of us that do want to focus in on the conversation, I think getting those offline as quick as possible is going to be a lot more productive than the angry commenting on posts, the shouting to the void. And then, because the thing is, when we're in person, we can't just shut our laptop and walk away. We have to stick it out and figure out a place to get to consensus. That's harder to do on the internet when we're not in the same kind of physical space with each other.
Yes, that's really good. It reminds me of There is another episode of Dear Bree with Mallory Contois. She runs a fabulous community called Old Girls Club, and she's done a lot of experimentation with figuring out how to foster a space online and even asynchronously in Slack. She'd be the first to say she's gone through periods of, nope, we're not talking about this at all, to we're going to test it out in this little space.
Yes.
These are the rules.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are interested, that's a great follow-up to this conversation as well. Yeah. And when we first connected, it was actually on the heels of I had come across in a late night deep doom scroll on Instagram and despairing of the state of the world, which is pretty much all that only comes with your doom scroll on Instagram these days. I came across this podcast called The Necessary Conversation, and it is this family that sits down every Sunday to talk about politics, and they are diametrically opposed. And upon coming across it, I thought, oh my gosh, wow, maybe they are having a conversation. Maybe it is helpful. And I remember coming to you on our call and being like despairing because I was like, oh my God, they couldn't do it. I sincerely applaud anyone who is willing to show up to the table like that and embrace those difficult conversations. But after watching a couple episodes, I was like, I don't see good coming from this at the moment. And maybe there's like moments, or maybe there's, I don't think I can just declare this is doing more harm than good necessarily and make that judgment. But it did strike me that this doesn't seem like the thing that's going to bridge the gap. I hear you saying we might need to be a little bit sneakier, and not to say that we have an ulterior motive, where it's like we actually just need to focus on the social bonds and the strength of our social bonds, and the rest will play out and unfold accordingly.
Yeah, I think getting back to those kind of basic building blocks, and I also want to be careful, this isn't a total black and white binary. You cannot do this online. This can only be done in person. But I think for a lot of us, if we've been trying to make this happen online and it's not producing successful results, or we've been trying to make this happen across the dinner table from this example you mentioned and from this letter writer, trying to get the action outside, I think is worth a shot, at least right now. Yep.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah.
This really touches on a big question that I had. And this was in rewatching Join or Die last night. The film, it never really distinguishes between politically oriented groups like the National Women's Suffrage Association and a club that really has nothing to do with politics or democracy, like your bowling league. And I noticed they're all clumped together a little bit with club, association, like group gathering. And my curiosity is if in clumping these together, are we oversimplifying the issue? And is there any benefit to distinguishing? And so what I'm hearing you say is like, actually the non-politically centered clubs, groups, associations are even more necessary right now in this time to build that social capital. Am I hearing you right? Or is it a balance of both, or one over the other? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think both are important. In the film, we use a very Big Tent definition of club. So we're talking about clubs in your workplace, like unions. We're talking about clubs in your spiritual life, like religion. We're talking about, as you mentioned, clubs that are explicitly political, like being a member of a political organization or an advocacy group, clubs as neighborhood associations. Really anything that is getting people together in groups of 2 or more people to do something, we would consider a club. And as far as political versus non-political, one of the ultimate messages of the film is that it is with others that we build power. And I think anytime we are building power, it is political, because we can then use that power towards very great ends of change in how we want to see our world looking. So sometimes a club that might start as something that just seems like a social organization. Let's say recently there's been a lot of stroller clubs popping around as like new dad groups. Like instead of dads going out and walking their kid by themselves, there was a gentleman in Brooklyn who started one of these a couple of years ago, and they've spread like wildfire all across the country. This one dad said, why don't I get 10 or 20 of us and we're going to walk together? So this starts just as a social organization. This club just started. These have been popping up just in the last few years. But what those groups might encounter as they're walking is some unsafe intersections. They might encounter some parks that aren't being cleaned up properly, where there's needles on the ground from drug users in their community. And, what that dad now has, instead of being one person walking alone who says, oh man, I really wish someone would do something about this, he suddenly has 20 people that he's been meeting up weekly to go on these walks that he's ready to mobilize and take to City Hall, to his community board, to his neighborhood association to try to do something about it. So I encourage folks listening or folks that kind of watch the film that are in clubs to remember that it's in your numbers that you're building power. And something that could start as an innocent social organization has a lot of potential to really put their hand on the scale of what things look like in our kind of built world around us.
That's so good. And that was something I noticed in the film too. It was mentioned several times that political movements often originated in purely social environments or church basements or the women's dinner club or whatever it was. Yeah. I really like that point.
Yeah. Yeah. One cool history thing that I learned in making the film, my mom was a member of a book club. She's still in it in our community in Falls Church, Virginia. She's been a member of this women's only book club for 30 or 40 years now. And I was always like, why is it all women? Especially growing up in the 1990s, as there was a lot more kind of gender mixing and stuff. And I'm like, this is old fashioned. But I've learned over the course of making this film that a lot of women's book clubs, they grew out of a women's self-education movement. So when women weren't able to get into the university system, a lot of these women's book clubs sprouted up at the turn of the last century, 1910s, 1920s. So again, that's a great example of something that seems innocent. A bunch of women sitting around eating snacks, reading books. They have a very serious kind of political history of women doing kind of self-education and taking that on their own, even as they were locked out from the predominant power structure. And then, of course, those book clubs could then feed into, as you mentioned, movements like getting women the right to vote and things that have had huge impacts on pushing our country towards being a better place.
This podcast is sponsored by Ember Consulting, where I'm the founder and head community creator. At Ember, we help people who are familiar with running their business on content, coaching, or consulting become community powered. As you hear in this podcast, creating a community is really tough and managing it can be even harder. So don't do it alone. Whether you're looking to launch a new community or pivot your strategy, our one-on-one consulting helps you skip the learning curve and do it right the first time. And when you're ready to belong to a space just for community creators learning, testing, and growing their communities together, check out the Ember community. Now, back to the episode. I really appreciated how you all navigated telling that story in the film of how in so many ways the groups that we gather in can be in reaction to marginalization and a lack of access to resources and power.
Yeah.
And yet how the exclusivity of certain groups can also be designed to perpetuate the inequalities. So I really feel like that was masterfully done because I noticed it early on as you're even showing pictures of these historical groups and you're like, there's some differences and like people are gathering in some ways to create power and in other ways to hoard power. And I really appreciated how you navigated that.
I think we have to look honestly at how, our clubs and associational life have impacted or have reflected what we looked at like at different moments in our history. Groups that were excluded by race, gender, nationality, and what are our efforts that we're pushing towards now? How do we want those reflected in what the groups that we're in look like today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the creation of Join or Die, there was a line about how Robert Putnam's work put data and this cohesive narrative behind something that everyone had been feeling in their gut for years. And I'm curious, did this feel true for you personally? Like, did you see this kind of show up in your own life? Did you feel like the documentary put a narrative to something that you had been witnessing and feeling yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I joke that this film was like a little bit of a therapy project for me. I came to this film, my brother and I co-produced the film with my brother, Pete Davis, who was actually a student of Robert Putnam's in college. So he had access to Robert Putnam on this personal level. When we approached Robert Putnam in 2017, it was the year Bob was retiring from teaching. He taught a famous class at Harvard called Community in America. And we said, how do we take this class, distill it into an hour-and-a-half movie, and break it out of the gates of the university and share it with everyone in America? And that was our attempt with the film. But at that time, when we approached Bob Putnam in 2017, I had been working as a journalist for many years, and I was covering a lot of these symptoms on the ground of the bowling alone phenomenon. So a lot of weeks, I was based in New York City, but flying out around the country. And no matter where I was going in the US, whether it was somewhere in the Northeast or the South or rural communities, cities, I was hearing the same thing over and over again from different Americans, that they felt like things were off in their community. They couldn't quite pinpoint it. That was bearing out in the stories I was covering too. A lot of stories that reflected the loneliness and isolation crisis that we all see in the headlines every day. I was covering things like school shootings, the opioid epidemic, rising suicide numbers, and just declining participation in our community life. And so this film for me, and partnering up with my brother and approaching Bob, was a chance to just not keep covering the symptoms over and over again, but say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's zoom out. There's people that have been studying these kind of trends and might have some ideas for us as we look for how to pull out of what we've been living through for most of my lifetime. So that was my kind of personal story in coming to the film. And then, of course, the big surprise was that then COVID hit right in the middle in 2020, kind of halfway through our production, which I think brought it that much more, especially on the isolation side of things, to the forefront of the conversation for a lot of us as our work life changed and as we lived through this kind of great social experiment of what does it look like to live inside our home and only see our friends and family over Zoom for a year. And for that, I don't think any of us needed data to know this was not as good as the real deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. What? Good? Bad? Good? Timing?
Yeah. Any big project, you enter in one world and don't know what's going to kind of transpire over the course of working on it. But I've been encouraged when releasing it is I'm meeting tons of people every day now that are working to reverse these trends. And I might be now one of the more optimistic people because I live in a very different news bubble than I think your average person who's seeing those folks aren't always highlighted as much as I think they should be in our headlines. But there's a lot of really incredible work happening all across the country right now.
Yeah. Yep. And that brings up a really good distinction and something that I'm constantly distinguishing from in our community building world. I draw a pretty rigid line between the work of social media as building an audience and differentiating that between with what we do in building community, where an audience is one directional, one speaker to many, a community is multi-directional. An audience is posited to consume content, but a community participates. I think we see a massive turning point where people are both addicted to and completely fed up with the consumer nature of our media.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've recognized that where social media promised connection, we got consumption. And I think particularly in the world of community building, we're starting to see that change. What would you say to someone who's just starting out, like creating a community, whether it's online or locally in person, about the importance of their work, the distinction with what we've seen in social media? Like, do you have any wisdom for them?
I think one thing I hone in on a lot is, and I think this speaks to all those kind of important distinctions that you brought up, is how do you try to get the widest amount of participation possible? And I think that's really where the strength comes from. And I think it's another counterintuitive message in our moment where I think the tech world wants to push a narrative of efficiency. And participation is not an efficient process. Getting a lot of people working together, it's harder work and it can take more time. But the fruits of that labor are way more beneficial if your goal is not necessarily just racking up sales, but actually building or doing something really fast for corporate efficiency. And there is a place for that. But if we really want to build loyal communities where people are feeling a sense of belonging, it's going to be trying to figure out how to get the widest participation possible so that everyone in the group is feeling shared ownership over the project. And it can be somewhat ironic because sometimes people, I think, go in thinking, well, how do I make this as easy as possible? Because people are really busy. But there's been a lot of studies done on successful community organizing, and it's actually asking people to do more work keeps them coming back more. And it's because I think of that mechanism of them feeling like it's theirs and not just a patron-client sort of situation where I'm going to go home and write a Yelp review and it's someone else's problem to make it better, but it's something we're all working on together.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. I love that point. I frame it like our two kind of icons, idols of our society are comfort and convenience. And marketing community in an environment where comfort and convenience reign supreme is such a wild ride because it is not comfortable or convenient. It is neither of those things.
Yes.
Especially when it's working well.
Yeah.
And it's always so funny, and it takes a lot of coaching on my end when I get clients who come to me who are like, we want to build a community. These are really busy people. Like, they're really important and they're really busy and they really don't have time. So we can't ask a lot of them. And I'm like, well, that's where onboarding is going to start. Because unless we reframe for them, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. They're not going to, if they don't expect to show up here and give, this community is going to flop. It's not comfortable. It's not convenient, but they are going to get back 10 times what they gave. But we have to ask them and we have to explicitly tell them exactly what we expect them to give, because we've literally lost the muscles. Like
100%. Yeah.
We expect the transactional nature. The other term that's coming to me that you shared was generalized reciprocity, and this kind of tipping point in a community where people get this sense of like, oh, I can show up and give a little, and it's not that person is going to give me something back right away, but I just trust that in this ecosystem, someone's going to help me out when the time is right. And we've lost that like sense that happens in communities. And so much of our work, and what's nice about building community and dedicated community platforms is people aren't in a social media environment. It's a different digital space. And so we can retrain them. But when we can really design for generalized reciprocity, that was like, oh, totally. That's the word. Yes. That's the word I've been looking for.
Yes. Yeah. And I also want to call out like that word design, like these platforms that we're spending lots of time in and that are new ones that are coming out almost every day. They are not neutral. The design has very real implications. Before we got on, I was listening to your other episode that you'd done with Noelle Flowers. You had a conversation kind of about Slack and how to interact in that space. But she had like more of a throwaway comment at the start of the chat where she was talking about Nextdoor. Nextdoor came on the scene with this promise that it was going to connect neighbors. And she said in that chat with you, she had never seen a helpful post once on Nextdoor. If the promise of your platform is we're going to connect neighbors, and then the users are saying this is totally unhelpful, except mostly for entertainment and watching people get into petty fights from us, it is failing. And I don't mean to call out Nextdoor explicitly. I'm sure.
Oh, no, it's okay. We can do that. We can do that here.
We need to be taking that critical eye on every single new platform that we're spending time on and building communities with, either as it's helping facilitate more in-person meeting up, or if it's communities that might be dispersed and existing only online. That needs to be kind of a constant assessment and conversation, because it is not neutral and it has impacts, and we need to be ready to change and pivot when it's not delivering on the promise. Otherwise, we're all just wasting our time. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. I say this about community design, but it's just as true about tech design and user experience. Your community is perfectly designed to give you the outcome that it's giving you today. And your community tool is perfectly designed to give you the dumpster fires that you're seeing. So let's redesign it.
Yeah.
And I have to give a little shout out because I've been following the journey of, I'm on the founding team for a new app called Local. I mentioned to you, I want to connect you to the founder, Bob Dalton. They're going through like a round of fundraising right now. It's one that I'm watching for specifically local communities, and it has, I'm curious to see how they can code the heart and the intention that's behind it, because I think they're onto something really good. And most of my work being on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is more so in the digital spaces, but my local life is so, and my local advocacy and my local social life is so important to me. And so finding solutions that are tapping into a more local solution is essential. And it's going to be what we have to move into in the future.
Yeah. Excited to follow that project. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. So I have an awkward question for you. Just follow me down the trail for a second. Yeah. The vast majority of my work in community within the system of capitalism that we exist in is creating two types of communities. So either communities for product companies. So communities where people who love that product or who want to learn about that product can gather in this community, or it's communities that are the product. So people pay to be a part of it, either to be a part of that network or to go through this educational journey together. These types of communities are unequivocally on the rise. Like I just read the latest CMX report. We'll link to it which is more for like the product communities. Is this concerning for you that this sort of new face of community life online is centered around generating profit? I know clubs and associations traditionally have had dues, but what we're seeing today, is it different? Is it the same? Is it concerning to you? Like, just riff with me on this a little bit.
Yeah. I think in any endeavor, asking who is benefiting as you're looking out at your world and analyzing, and I think if the people in the community are creating the wealth, but then not getting to benefit from any of the wealth, I would say that's something to explore. And I think that could be an example of an online community where all the people are participating, but the wealth is all going to one person. That seems not fair. It should be, from my perspective, going back into the community that creates it and then going back to benefit that community. So I would take a hard look at that if that's where you're spending your time and ask if that feels fair. But I think we can also take that onto the ground in our communities. Increasingly, a lot of us live in places where when we walk down our main street, a lot of the businesses are national, multinational corporations who are taking in all the benefits of our purchasing power. And I think for our city planners, we need to ask if all of our restaurants on our downtown strip are all chain restaurants where the money's heading back to someone in New York City or in another country even. Maybe we need to switch up that mode and get some more independent businesses so that we can keep that capital in our community where it can go a lot further and then benefiting when we want to put money into a local park, when we want to put money into rebuilding our library. Those local companies are going to be looking out for that much more because they live there. I think it's an important question to raise, but it's a hard one to make a blanket statement by. I think we need to all be asking ourselves case by case in all situations. And I think that was our hope with the film, was that instead of just moving through the world passively, how do we turn on this lens and really start thinking deeply and having these conversations together with our neighbors about what is best for our community?
That's really good. I've had very seemingly contradictory hot takes on both sides of this aisle. I've had moments, and I think it's seemingly contradictory. It actually all does somehow live and exist in my body in a way that I can be okay with. But I've had moments, I've come across arguments where people are like, create an argument for why communities should never charge and why they shouldn't be paid. And by charging for a community, you are pouncing on and leveraging the loneliness epidemic to your gain, which I certainly think can happen. I also see so many community builders putting in a ton of time and effort to facilitate a space and gather the members and feeling guilty for charging anything and like what they're worth. And so a part of me has railed against that and said, of course we need to charge for our work and the labor that we're putting in. And there's immense power being created in these communities, not just financially, but to your point, social capital. And so maybe a part of the benefit to the community builders isn't necessarily the financial wealth that's being generated. And maybe that's not. And usually, to be honest, like the best communities that I've been a part of, that's not the top priority is financial wealth. It is social capital, and it's building the strength of the bonds between members. So I go back and forth, but yeah.
And I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think there's one situation where I need money to support myself to do this work, and how much is the appropriate amount to pay your healthcare, pay your rent, and it's a full-time job that facilitator is doing. And then I think we can all acknowledge there's a difference when someone's creating some type of online community and they're trying to become a millionaire and then spend their summers on a super yacht off of Greece. Yeah. So I think there's space for us to kind of look critically and understand that if someone's doing something as a full-time job, yes, they need compensation for that. And when I look back at the to charge or not to charge question for membership, so many of our clubs used to have these beautiful actual temples to community life. If you've ever lived in a community that has an old Masonic temple or an old women's club, that were kind of these beautiful old houses and buildings, those took money to build. But that was a case of members pooled their money together and then all got to benefit from the riches of then having a physical space to meet in, which is something that comes up a lot on our tour as I'm talking to people with the film is we want to meet up. It's hard for us to find a space. And something like membership dues can help. Maybe that's not something in the first year of your roadmap, but as you're building capacity and wanting to do something collectively, like buy a space, offer other benefits that can come from pooling money together, I think those are important conversations for groups to have.
Yeah, that's really good. I love the question of who is this benefiting is it very insightful, very simple, but will help you get to the root of it pretty quick.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so to wrap us up, if our goal is to bridge the gap, create understanding, preserve our fragile democracy,
yes,
what are some of the things, like just to summarize it up, what are some of the things that we can do to help us get there, both in our families and in our communities?
Yeah. I just want to call it, those are no small things, obviously. What can we do?
How can we save democracy?
But one thing, so I want to acknowledge the pressure on everyone's shoulders right now. But I think one thing that so drew me to kind of Bob's work as we were approaching him about being in the film is he has a simple solution to that question that's supported by decades of data, which is towards that effort, you don't need to go out and start the next national nonprofit. It can be as easy as starting to get together with 3 or 4 of your neighbors down the street from you, and things will build up from there. And certainly as we look to examples in our history, that's how so many of our major turning points in history, our major movements towards making our democracy try to live up to its potential, they've all started with 2 or 3 people getting together in a room to chat, to say, what do we want to do? And so one thing we've been telling a lot of people on the tour is, it can be asking yourself the simple question of what am I doing alone that I could be doing together? And if you're cooking dinner alone every night, could you start a dinner party club with 5 of your neighbors and go to different people's house every night? And that takes both the burden off your shoulder of cooking dinner 5 nights a week, and you're also building social capital and having fun while you're doing it. So if it's cooking dinner, if it's doing childcare alone, could you start a childcare cooperative? If you're complaining to your boss by yourself, could you get together with your coworkers and do a collective action to try to change something that you don't like about your workplace? So really starting to take that survey. And as far as folks that feel crunched for time, I don't like to be finger waggy about some of the data around how much time we are spending online. But as of last year, the average American is spending 10 hours a day consuming media. 5 hours of that is television-based content. And then the other 5 is time on our cell phones, consuming social media and articles and podcasts. So if we're looking for somewhere where maybe we just claw back 30 minutes, 1 hour, I think that's a good place to start. And we've got a lot of room to grow, which makes this an exciting moment because some of the more recent data around Americans' organizational habits is that 43% of Americans right now belong to 0 groups and associations.
Wow.
So if you're listening and you're in that 43%, don't feel bad because that is almost half of our country. But try to think, is there something, do you run by yourself? Can you start a run club? Do you like watching movies? Invite some friends over. You got a movie club. And we'll see where we're at 5, 10, 20 years from now. But I think that's where it starts.
So simple, So applicable. I love the action item of sit down, make a list of what do I do alone that I could do in person. And even from complaining about my boss to, and I'm thinking of like entrepreneurs like myself, where so much of my work is done solo, and even tools like Cave Day, where you're just doing it on Zoom with other entrepreneurs, or there are so many creative solutions that have popped up. And so it could be you starting something. It also could just be you joining something that already exists. Don't be afraid to be a joiner.
Yes. Love that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. This was delightful. I love just talking shop, but seeing the far-reaching implications. And I think at the same time that it is maybe a very scary time, it's also, I feel, filled with hope and excitement about what this is going to bring out of us, because it's just so undeniable at this point that we are called upon to do something about it. And it's exciting to me. So thank you for bringing that.
Thanks for having me. Great to chat.
Thank you so much for sharing some space with me on this episode. Please like and review wherever you find your podcasts. To submit your own community conundrum, fiasco, or other drama, go to the link in the show notes. Aloha and catch you next time.